If you lived in Austin in the 1970s, you did not feel like you were standing at the center of Texas. That feeling belonged to Dallas with its glass towers and oil money, or to Houston with its refineries and shipping lanes. Austin felt smaller, quieter, and slightly unfinished. It behaved like a place that people passed through and then stayed longer than they planned. The city carried the steady presence of government offices and the University of Texas at Austin, where enrollment hovered around 39,000 students at the start of the decade. That population shaped everything. Streets emptied and refilled with academic calendars. Coffee shops and record stores survived on student traffic. Rent houses clustered near campus, often worn, often affordable, rarely impressive. There was no pressure to build upward. Austin spread out instead, low and horizontal, with neighborhoods that felt closer to small towns than to a modern metropolis. Downtown still felt modest. There was no dense skyline casting long shadows in the afternoon. At night, the city went dark early, broken only by porch lights and the faint glow from a handful of bars and music halls. The moonlight towers, rising 165 feet above the streets, felt less like infrastructure and more like watchful relics from another era. It was a time when Austin did not promise much. That was precisely the appeal. You came for school, for a job with the state, or simply because it was cheaper than anywhere else worth living. And once you arrived, you sensed that the city was quietly becoming something, even if no one could yet explain what that something was. Most people lived in modest, single-story houses or aging rental homes, tucked into quiet streets near the university or along the city's expanding edges. A 3-bedroom ranch-style house in Texas during the early part of the decade typically cost between $22,000 and $25,000, making home ownership feel attainable rather than aspirational. These were not show homes. They were practical spaces with thin walls, boxy layouts, and front yards that baked under the sun. Inside, the details were familiar and unremarkable in a comforting way. Wall-to-wall carpet in muted browns or faded oranges softened footsteps. Wood veneer cabinets lined kitchens that smelled faintly of coffee and cigarette smoke. Ceiling fans turned slowly through humid afternoons, doing more work than air conditioning units that were often weak or entirely absent. Windows stayed open for much of the year, carrying in the sound of cicadas and distant traffic. Neighborhoods moved at an unhurried pace. Mornings began early for state workers and university staff heading toward downtown offices or the campus. Cars pulled out of driveways before the heat settled in. Afternoons belonged to students drifting between classes, kids on bicycles, and retirees tending small gardens. There was little sense of urgency. Traffic was not yet a topic of conversation. Commute times did not shape daily decisions. Groceries were affordable. Rent was often shared. Part-time and seasonal work filled the gaps. Austin in the 1970s offered something rare even then, a feeling that ordinary life was manageable, steady, and quietly sufficient. Movement in Austin during the 1970s revolved almost entirely around the car. The city was spread out, and public transportation played only a minor role in daily routines. A new car early in the decade typically cost between $3,000 and $3,900, placing ownership within reach for students, state employees, and young families. Parking was rarely an issue. Streets were wide, lots were open, and driving felt uncomplicated. Large sedans with soft suspensions moved slowly through neighborhoods, their long hoods stretching forward like open land. Pickup trucks were common, not as symbols of identity, but as everyday tools, often coated in red dust and loaded with whatever the day demanded. Students relied on older second-hand cars, sun-faded and noisy, announcing their presence before the doors even opened. Infrastructure felt simple but sufficient. Roads were practical rather than impressive, Intersections were familiar, learned through repetition rather than signage. Above it all, the Moonlight Towers still stood, rising 165 feet into the night sky, casting a pale industrial glow that felt more historical than modern. Driving was not a performance. It was routine. You drove to campus, to work, to the store, and back again without thinking about it. The car represented ease and independence, carrying people quietly through a city that still moved at a human pace. By the middle of the decade, something unmistakable began to pulse through Austin after dark. Music was no longer background noise. It was becoming the city's language. On Barton Springs Road, a low industrial building opened in August of 1970 and reshaped the way Austin sounded at night. Armadillo World Headquarters looked unremarkable from the outside, but inside it held roughly 1,500 people packed onto wooden floors, the air thick with beer, sweat, and anticipation. If you were there, you remember the mix. Long hair beside cowboy hats. Students pressed shoulder to shoulder with state workers who had loosened their ties. Willie Nelson stepped onto that stage and bridged country music with the counterculture crowd. Frank Zappa brought something stranger and sharper. Later in the decade, the Ramones made the room feel smaller and faster, pushing Austin toward a broader identity. Near the university, places like Raoul's offered a different sound. Punk and new wave arrived quietly, carried by touring bands and students rather than by radio hits. These clubs were intimate and imperfect, sound systems distorted, floors stuck to your shoes. But that closeness made the music feel personal, almost private. During the day, the Austin Aqua Festival pulled the city together each summer. Loud, crowded, and unapologetically local, it reflected a place that celebrated itself without seeking outside approval. Austin simply allowed culture to grow, and in doing so, it laid foundations that would last far beyond the decade. For all its growing reputation at night, Austin remained a practical city by day. The economy of the 1970s did not revolve around sudden wealth or aggressive expansion. It revolved around stability. Government jobs anchored downtown, filling offices with clerks and administrators who arrived early and left at predictable hours. The University of Texas added another layer of employment, from faculty to student workers who kept the campus functioning. Unlike Houston, Austin was not directly tied to the oil boom. When the energy crises of 1973 and 1979 rippled across the country, the city felt pressure without panic. Gas prices rose. Lines appeared at stations. But Austin did not surge or collapse. Its economy moved at a steadier pace, buffered by public sector wages that rarely disappeared overnight. Workplaces were modest and practical. Offices depended on paper files, typewriters, and fluorescent lights. Air conditioning hummed through the summer heat. Lunch hours were simple. People brought food from home or walked to nearby diners where prices made eating out an easy choice. There was little talk of careers in the modern sense. Most people thought in terms of jobs rather than long-term paths. You stayed if the work was steady and the rent manageable. Austin did not offer rapid advancement, but in a decade marked by inflation and uncertainty, its quiet predictability became a form of security that shaped daily life in subtle ways. Shared rhythms in Austin during the 1970s did not come from professional sports or packed downtown stadiums. They came from smaller gatherings and repeated routines that drew people into the same places at the same times. The University of Texas functioned as a civic anchor, with games and seasonal events shaping weekends and conversations across the city. On Saturdays, crowds moved toward campus, filling streets that were otherwise quiet. The atmosphere was informal rather than overwhelming. Faces were familiar. Tailgates were simple, built around coolers and folding chairs. The focus was not spectacle, but presence. Being there mattered more than the final score. Public spaces reinforced that sense of connection. Zilker Park gathered families, students, and musicians, especially in warmer months when life spilled outdoors. Picnics turned into long afternoons. Frisbees flew. Someone brought a guitar, and someone else knew the chords. These moments were not organized events. They were habits repeated until they felt permanent. Festivals appeared without dominating the calendar. The Austin Aqua Festival returned each year as a shared ritual rather than a major attraction. People showed up because it was familiar and expected. Without a defining professional team, Austin built belonging through proximity and repetition. Community formed quietly, through people crossing paths often enough that connection became routine rather than something that needed to be announced. Beneath the ease of daily routines, Austin in the 1970s carried a growing unease about what came next. The city was changing, even if the pace felt slow. More people arrived for school, work, or simply because Austin offered a less compressed version of life than other parts of Texas. With that growth came questions that did not yet have clear answers. Debates over development surfaced quietly in city meetings and at kitchen tables. Some residents pushed for expansion, new housing, and modern infrastructure that could pull Austin closer to the economic weight of Dallas or Houston. Others feared that growth would erase what made the city livable. Green spaces, older neighborhoods, and small music venues began to feel fragile. Environmental concerns took on new meaning. Barton Springs became more than a swimming spot. It turned into a symbol of preservation, discussed in personal terms, as if the land itself needed protection. These debates unfolded slowly through petitions, local news, and informal coalitions, rather than public confrontation. At the same time, the cost of living edged upward. Housing remained affordable nationally, but longtime residents noticed change. Rents rose near the university. Older homes were renovated instead of replaced. Austin was no longer invisible, and the city ended the decade balanced between staying overlooked and becoming something larger and more complex. By the end of the 1970s, Austin no longer felt like a place waiting to be discovered. It felt like a place that had quietly discovered itself. New spaces appeared around the edges of the city, hinting at what was coming without announcing it. In 1979, the Cactus Cafe opened inside the University of Texas Union, small and unassuming, built for listening rather than spectacle. It fit a city that still valued closeness over scale. Change arrived through routine rather than headlines. More musicians passed through and stayed longer. More students graduated and chose not to leave. Neighborhoods that once felt temporary began to settle into permanence. Daily habits shifted slowly, almost unnoticed, as the city adjusted without marking each step. Austin was not yet a destination. There were no national spotlights or weekend trips planned around it. But those paying attention could see the outlines. A city that remained mostly affordable. A culture that resisted easy labels. A balance between work, music, and ordinary life that still held. Thank you for watching American Time Capsule TV. If you lived in Austin during the 1970s, or if you remember visiting when the city still felt this small, we would love to hear your story. Please subscribe to the channel and share your memories below. Did you spend your nights at Armadillo World Headquarters, or your afternoons near campus? Tell us what Austin felt like to you in the comments.